My name is Monk Rowe, and I'm very happy to have Mike Vax with me today. And you may not remember, but we sort of saw each other 50, maybe 1 years ago.
Really?
Yeah, 1971 or two at Suny Fredonia.
Oh, of course. Yes.
Yeah,
I got to tell you, I remember that whole thing very, very well. A guy that is still one of my close friends, John Lukey, was one of the Phi Mu Alpha people that got that to them to sponsor the Kenton Band, and we did a residency. I think we were there for like 3 days or something.
that's correct.
And I have to tell you, there's a great story. Um, at one point, we were doing a panel discussion. It was Stan and Dick Shearer and I. And they were talking about, liking to have, some of the teachers were talking about, having doctorates and all that. And Stan really started talking about how important it was that teachers, that musicians who knew how to teach, that had been on the road, that really understood what the music business is like and what it's like to be a road musician. He said, that's really important. In some ways, it's more important than pieces of paper. And so this discussion went on, and all of a sudden, I got this brain thing. It's like it just came to me. And this one teacher, and I understand where they're coming from because I taught in colleges, with only a bachelor's. And so he's really on this thing about the doctorate stuff. And I said, wait a minute, I have an idea. I have an idea for a comparison. So have you ever done a lot of playing professionally? And he said, well, no, I was working on my doctorate and I teach. And I said, well, okay, I want to point something out to you. Would you like to have a brain surgery done by a doctor who was taught by a doctor who had never done brain surgery? And I got this huge ovation from the students. I never forgot that.
Oh, I think you have some nerve in a positive way because I was reading this beautiful thing you wrote recently on Facebook. And you said that in 1960, you went to the Second National Stage Band Camp. And afterwards, you went up to Stan Kenton and said, I'm going to play lead trumpet in your band.
Right. I did.
And you were 17?
I was 17 years old, and it was interesting because in the earlier camps, there were more older guys than high school guys. So I was one of the younger guys. And I think I made lead in about the third band out of 12 or something, but Don Jacoby had been to my school and done a clinic at my high school. And he talked me into going to the camp, but that summer he had a gum infection and he couldn't go. So he called Connie Condoli and Jimmy Maxwell and said, I want you to look out for my kid, Mike. So I get there and I don't even remember my audition. I was so scared. I mean, it was my first time really away from home. And I'd taken a train from Oakland, California to Bloomington, Indiana. And so I go in there and all I remember is Connie said, oh, you're Jake's kid. So I did my audition, and I did okay. But they needed a fourth trumpet player for the faculty band, for the Kenton Band. And so here I am, this young kid, and they put me in the band. So I got to play under Stan when I was 17. And I was going to get a degree in classical performance, and I was going to be a symphony player. That's what I was planning on. Although I love jazz, but I was planning on being a symphony player. And that camp changed my whole outlook, because playing on the Kenton Band became the most important thing in my life that I wanted to do. And so at the end of the camp, I went up to Stan and I said, I'm going to play lead trumpet in your band someday. And what he said changed my life, because he said, if you want to bad enough, you probably will. And what I heard was Stan Kenton said I can play in his band.
Love it. I love
And
it. So when you
for
came
10,
to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would say for 10 years, between 5 years in college and 4 years in the Navy, my whole goal was I got to get on the Kenton band someday.
When you came to Fredonia, I think you probably were playing lead and you were the band manager. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
So I want you to try a little scenario here. You have to write a description to put in a newspaper, a job opportunity, lead trumpet for Stan Kenton. And how do you describe that job succinctly?
Well, it's a lot of pressure. I mean, and it's interesting that I was put on lead trumpet 2 days before the Redlands album. The lead trumpet player before me, Jim Karchner, had a brain tumor and didn't know it, and he was having all kinds of jaw problems. And a few days before, Redlands was the first album on Creative World. I mean, Stan was really nervous about this. It's his first album away from Capitol on his own label. And so Jim just said, I don't want to mess up the album. I can't do it. And Stan's thinking, well, do I get Buddy Childers or do I get Al Persino or do I get, and some of the guys in the band said, Vax can handle it. And so this is like 2 days before, and I get called down to breakfast, and Stan had been really nervous about this whole thing and was thinking about using big name guys from LA that had, been on the band before. And Willie Maiden, rest his soul, said to Stan, these young kids are playing your music as good as anybody ever has. And if you use any ringers, you can't record my music.
All right,
Well,
Willie.
he was adamant about you've always used your road band. You don't need the studio guys. So they call me down, Stan and Dick Shearer call me down to breakfast, and they're having small talk, while at breakfast. And I'm thinking, you SOBs, if you're going to fire me, just do it. And I'm thinking, I'm only the third trumpet player. Why am I getting fired? And I remember at the end of the meal, Stan had his coffee cup up and it stops halfway down, and he stares at me for it felt like an eon, and he says, I won't say the exact words. He says, the trumpet section is really screwed up. And I'm thinking, here it comes. And he says, the next thing out of his mouth is, can you handle the lead book? And I said, yeah, I can handle the lead book. And he said, good. And it better be right when we start recording Monday night. Stan knew when people were ready for things, whether it was a lead player or a jazz player that hadn't been playing a lot of solos. Stan was just such a great leader. He knew when people were ready for things. So he knew that I was ready for it, but he wanted me to say that I was ready for it. So, I think that being a lead trumpet on any big band, maybe especially the Kenton band, because the charts are so hard, but being the lead trumpet on any big band, you're sort of like the quarterback, and the drummer is like the other quarterback or the halfback that's as important as you are, and the lead trumpet and the drummer have to just get right together. They just have to be there. And of course, then the bass player comes in too, because you're talking about the time of the band. So it's a lot of responsibility, and it isn't so much high notes. All these people, the lead trumpet player, they got to play all these high notes. Maynard never played lead on the Kenton band. He played third trumpet, and his book was the high note trumpet. But Brisbois did play some lead, but a lot of the time on a lot of the recordings, he was the high note player, and Dalton Smith was the lead trumpet player. So it's not only a matter of having high notes and a high register. It's a matter of, can you play it exactly the same every single night? That's the important thing. The band is relying on the lead trumpet to set the stylistic approach, to set the articulations, to set time feel. And so there's a lot on your shoulders, and it's up to you. You have to, what I say to the kids is the lead trumpet player is the least creative person on the band. You have to play it the same every single night, whether you've played the chart 10 times or 1,000 times. You've got to put the energy in, you've got to make it, the audience feel like, yeah, this is really cool, but the consistency has to be there, and the time has to be there, and the sound has to be right to carry over the band, and have because a lot of times the lead trumpet has the melody.
Did you
So
ever
I
have
think
a
mainly it's the responsibility.
did you ever have a circumstance? There's a chart and there's drum breaks, or there's drum solo of a specific length, 4 bars, 8 bars, and the drummer played something and people aren't sure where one is. And it's coming up and we got to come back in. And do you take the reins and say, here's where it is?
Well, yes, but here's one thing I say to young drummers. I don't care if it's a fill or if it's a long solo or whatever it is. One is the most important thing. And you had better lead the band in with what you're playing so that the band knows where to come in. And great drummers always do that. I don't care if it's a 2-beat fill or if it's a 20-bar solo, whatever it is. Great drummers know how to lead the band in. But you're right, the lead trumpet player there are times, with different drummers, if they get into something, then I start counting. 2, 3. I'm sitting, okay, I want to make sure but great drummers always lead the band in.
Is there a discussion that would have happened back then when you became the lead player? Did you ever discuss things off the bandstand with the drummer and the bass player about, we're not hanging together on this? Or is it just something that has to happen while you're playing?
I think it's a bit of both. I don't think the responsibility of the lead trumpet player is that you have to make sure things are going, because in a professional situation, if things aren't happening in the band, there are times when the leader is going to blame the lead trumpet player, and yeah, there are times that, especially with John Von Ohlen and John Wooster, that we talked about different charts, and it wasn't like John was saying, well, Vax, you're not coming in right, or I was saying, well, you're not leading. It's just what we were discussing is how we made the chart feel better and sound better to the audience.
Yeah. A number of Basie alums have talked about how the Count was sort of a hands-off. He didn't say anything unless something was really bad. And I wondered if Stan was like that, or was he more hands-on? And how did he deal with any, I guess I'll call them discipline issues?
Well, first of all, Stan was very hands-on. And to play in that band, you had to be 110% all the time. The concentration level. I'll tell you, this is a great one. I don't remember when this happened, but it was something where we, any of the band leaders, they're basically going to play tunes from the last album and tunes that made them famous. And so they get into this thing of different tours. You're going to play almost the same charts every night, and sometimes the band is getting, come on, let's do something different. And this one time, I remember Stan had been thinking about it. And as I say, he was very hands-on. And so before this one concert, he came up in front of the band and he said, the band is getting complacent and I don't like it. He said, you guys aren't getting your charts up. And you get to the point where you got the charts memorized, almost, you got the order memorized and you got the charts memorized. So he said, every person will get out every chart and read every note tonight. And you know what? The band sounded different. And so I would say he was very hands-on, but you got to remember, almost everybody that ever played on that band said he was the best leader to work for. He was like a father to us. They called him the old man in the earlier bands. even though that wasn't that much older than them. But yeah, he was, you had to be there. You had to be on top of things all the time. And I can remember times when he wasn't happy with some people, and he'd call them aside and say, hey man, you gotta be doing better. And it wasn't, it was never mean. It felt like he was being mean. It felt like he was being the father figure, taking care of the business of the band.
What did your band manager duties entail? Were you in charge of booking motel rooms and all that kind of thing? Wow.
I had to book all the hotels, had to collect all the money, had to stay in touch with the Harold Plant's office, that were the people that handled all of Stan's finances and money and stuff. If we were getting paid in cash, you had to take it to, there were a couple of different banks that we used where Stan had accounts, and you'd have to take it. It was really funny because sometimes we'd be out for 7 or 8, 9 days without getting to a bank or anything, and I'd have a whole bunch of cash with me. And so I thought, okay, the safest way is I'm gonna wear old clothes and I'm gonna put all the money in a paper bag, and then I'm gonna go to the bank. And I used to do that. And every once in a while, one of the tellers would look at me like, is this guy a drug dealer or what? But I thought, well, that's the safest way to get to the bank. But, and the other thing was that Stan didn't take a salary. He was amazing. All the money went to the band. The road manager was expected to have a few $1,000s on him in case Stan needed to take people to dinner, or he needed to buy some clothes or whatever. But he didn't take an actual salary. And so, yeah, I booked the hotel rooms. I did all of the financial stuff. I had to deal when there were, people who, buyers who were not being very nice. I had to deal with that. Stan didn't want to deal with that. And when Stan was sick that first time in 1971, and he was gone for 5 months, Dick Scher and I led the band, and Dick led the music and conducted, and I did, all of the announcing, and I did all of the, still doing, all of the financial stuff. And I literally had to, verbally fight with people to get the money. The office, they had this whole thing down where they would send a telegram the day before saying, we thought Mr. Kenton was going to be able to rejoin the band, but the doctors wanted him to stay a little longer. Well, it was all lies, because we had to keep the band on the road for him. So I had to pretend that, oh, gee, I really did think Stan was going to be joining us, but they just said at the last minute he can't. And so then they would, a lot of times, especially clubs and things like that, they try to say, well, you broke the contract because Stan isn't here. And I'd say, you sold out. We're trying to keep this band on the road for Stan while he's sick, and you're sold out. You made money. Don't give me that stuff about you want to, we broke the contract and you want to. There were a couple of places that, they'd given the 50% deposit and they wanted to not pay the other 50%. And I had to fight with them, and all except one club, the Losers Club, believe it or not, it was the Losers Club in Dallas. And that one was a huge scene where the guy, he was was sort of like his own little mafia thing, and he had these guys with guns and all that. And so we're back there, and Dick Scher and I are trying to say, come on, you sold out. We were here 2 nights. You sold out, and so Willie Maiden brings some of the bigger guys back in there, and this guy's got his 2 thugs, and Willie says, listen, man, this is going to be like the back in the 30s, man. You don't pay the band, we're going to wreck the club. And
I can see Willie Maiden would have had to bring some of the bigger guys, because he looked like.
Oh yeah, exactly. And that was the only place in the 5 months that Stan was gone that I didn't get the rest of the money. All the rest, I just, it was part of what my job was. And yeah, as road manager, there were times that I had to do some disciplining, especially when Stan was gone.
Okay.
because when the cat's away, the mice will play, so to speak. And it's not the guys were taking advantage, but again, they were getting complacent a little bit and taking advantage. And there were a couple of times where I had to threaten to fire guys. I didn't actually fire anybody while Stan was gone. I had to fire some people other times where Stan, that was one of my duties, and Stan said to get rid of him, but I didn't have to fire anybody while Stan was gone. Everybody believed, we have to keep this band on the road for Stan because we love him.
Was there a union rule of a sort that you had to give like a 2-week notice?
Yeah.
Either way, if a guy wanted to quit, 2 weeks, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And that's only fair both sides. So that's what we would do. Mm-hmm. Or if there was some instance, there was only one instance I can remember where it was just a situation where the guy needed to be gone, and Stan basically paid him his 2 weeks and
I see.
And sent him home, and got somebody else.
You probably know this, that when I'll just use the Fredonia experience, you were probably only 7 or 8 years older than the guys that were juniors and seniors who were in the college jazz band.
Some of the guys in the band were the same age.
Yes. Okay, that's my point. And so, I wonder if you knew back then that a lot of these musicians really wanted to be you, or to be the tenor player, or in other words, they wanted to do what you were doing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And there were times when we needed somebody where we got them from a college, or most of the time was from the summer camps. There were guys like Dennis Noda that were hired from the summer camps, and Stan, age didn't matter to Stan. It's how good you could play. When Gary Pack joined the band as a jazz trumpet player, he was 19. And of course, the stories. Back in the 40s, Buddy Childers and Art Pepper were both 16 when they joined the band. And Stan had to sign papers to and the parents had to give permission for them to go on the road. And so he definitely, and when we taught, because 3-4 days a week we were in schools. I mean, that's how the band kept on the road. And so the questions, a lot of them would be, what's it like being on the band, and how do we get on the band, and how do we get on any band, and basically we'd say, practice your butt off, be able to sight read, and then when opportunity comes, I really think that while there is such thing as good luck, I think that the Boy Scouts motto is the most important thing, which is be prepared. If the good luck comes and you're prepared, you'll be ready for it. And that's what I used to tell the students in the clinics, and I still do. I still say, there's not much work compared to when I was your age, now especially, but for the ones that really care to work hard enough and really want it bad enough, there's still ways to do it.
Did Stan explain his vision there was a number of wonderful writers that, did charts for the group. And I'm wondering how much Stan would give them instructions. Here's what I want, here's what I don't want, etc.
I think he did both. I think there were certain writers that, like Ken Hanna, when I was on the band, Ken Hanna, Willie Maiden, Hank Levy, where Stan just let them pretty much have their own, because they knew what Stan wanted. I mean, even you go back to the earlier writers, Pete Rugolo and Bill Russo and Johnny Richards, they all knew what Stan wanted. And a lot of times, like with Cuban Fire, which, if I had to say, even over the albums I'm on, probably my favorite Kenton album, Stan said to Johnny Richards, the Latin guys think that when we play Latin stuff, it isn't real. It's not official. We got to figure it out. And of course, Johnny was Mexican, but he went and he hung with a lot of the Cuban musicians in New York. And he went and he hung with them and he listened. So when he wrote Cuban Fire and Cuban Fire came out, a lot of those musicians said, Stan's got it. So I think that Stan did instruct Johnny what he wanted. And it was basically, I want the Latin musicians to accept what we're doing. With Hank Levy's time charts, Hank Levy had played on Stan's band in the late 40s, I think, played baritone sax and done a little bit of writing. But then, of course, later on got into the thing with Don Ellis with all the time charts, and Stan decided, obviously before we did all those in the 70s, when Stan recorded Adventures in Jazz with Joni Richards, I mean, amazing time charts. But we really got into it with public performance of time charts with Hank, and Stan pretty much gave him the head, And I think that basically, another writer, Bill Holman, Stan and Bill Holman used to argue about tempos. Stan would usually want things faster than Bill Holman had thought of them in his head, But think of all the great music that Bill Holman not only wrote for the Kenton Band, but Basie and all these other bands. I mean, Bill Holman's maybe one of the most prolific big band writers in history. He and Sammy Nestico and a few others. And so with Bill, Stan would sometimes, I don't think argue, but they would discuss exactly what he wanted. Because Bill even talks about that he came from Jerry Mulligan. And where he got all his contrapuntal ideas of writing really came from Jerry Mulligan. Jerry Mulligan only wrote 6 charts for the Kenton Band, and Stan didn't really like that many of them because, back then, in the early 50s, those were all the great bebop players. And Stan used to say, listen, I don't want to be Woody Herman, man. I want to play my music, because they wanted to swing more. It's like, I don't know if there's an interview with Shelley Mann, and he was asked, what's it like playing drums on the Kenton Band? And Shelley Mann said, chopping wood.
This ain't a wood chopper's ball here.
And then one time, they're having some discussion with some of the musicians, and Stan is, saying, I got certain ideas that I want this band to do. And it isn't a matter of swing. It isn't a matter of coming from the old big bands and the dance bands. It's a matter of being a concert jazz orchestra. And I guess this was on the bus or something. And from the back of the bus, Al Persino, who always talked very slow, said, why don't you try swinging? But Stan, of all the leaders, Stan knew what he wanted. And if you think about it, the Basie band of the 30s and 40s, the Basie band of the 70s sounds pretty much the same. It's the Basie sound. You think about how many times the sound of the Kenton Band changed. And it was always Stan's vision going on to the next thing. He was always looking forward, and so the stuff from the late 40s, and then the orchestra that he took on tour in the early 50s and stuff, some of that stuff was just so far out that the audiences didn't know what to do. They're like the recording of City of Glass, and all that. And then all of a sudden, he got through with that, and you get like to the early 50s, a little bit later, and it's the contemporary concepts, and it's all of this just stuff that in the Kenton way swings its butt off. The change was phenomenal.
Speaking of swinging its butt off, name this tune. Are you ready?
Yeah. Oh, that's intermission riff, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so intermission riff. Now, how does Yard Dog Mazurka go?
Almost the same.
Almost the same.
And Ray Wetzel swore that he did not copy, Yard Dog Mazurka. And it's funny, but then if you think about it, artistry and rhythm sounds almost exactly like Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. And Stan again swore that he did not take it from that. But you think maybe some years earlier he heard a recording of it and it went stuck in here. Yeah. But like with artistry and rhythm, it goes be da 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 dee dee da, and Daphnis and Chloe goes dee da 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 dee dee dee. It's only one note difference.
Nowadays we'd be in court over that.
Probably so. But
I had the funniest experience.
And the riff in the beginning, there was no chart. It was a head chart.
Okay.
Ray just taught, they were just going to use it as a break tune. So yeah. Ray just taught it to everybody.
Right.
And then over the years, they, more arrangements were done. And of course, the arrangement that we play with the Kenton Legacy Orchestra that Kim Richmond did, in the middle of it, he voiced out Carl Fontana's whole trombone solo from Kenton in Hi-Fi. He voiced out Carl Fontana's whole trombone solo for the whole band. Hmm. So in the middle of Intermission Riff, you have Carl Fontana's solo that the whole band is playing. Wow. So we have an even more updated version of it. But that's probably one of them that was played the most of anything with the Kenton band. That and Peanut Vendor.
Oh, right. And we played that too, of course, at Fredonia. Yeah. I wanted to change subjects a little bit here and ask you about some of your recordings. There's one that goes back a ways. Old Time Concert in the Park.
Oh, the Vacuosity CD.
Yeah.
That's with the Ohlone Wind Orchestra. Mm-hmm. And that's an adult it's an adult concert band that Ohlone College sponsors, and over half of them are full-time professional musicians. This band is just phenomenal. And Tom Johnson, who has been my recording person and sound person, for 20 years, or more than 20 years, 30 years, was teaching there in their recording studio. They had a big recording studio, and he was actually teaching recording techniques. And he arranged it. I forget how it came about. I think we were just talking, and he knew that my degree actually is in classical performance, and he knew that I had done cornet playing and stuff. And so somehow or other, we came up with this idea of doing something nobody had ever, the people that were fans of mine from Kenton or Dukes of Dixieland or whatever, would sort of be surprised at. So we decided to record that. And one of the catalysts was that tune Vacuosity, which Lieutenant Commander Phil Field wrote for me, the leader of the Navy band. And that was written for concert band. And so we recorded that thing over the course of I think about 6 weeks. We'd do a few tunes at a time, and then I'd be on the road a little bit, and then I'd come back, and but a lot of that stuff on that recording, that band was just sight reading. They played it down once and then recorded it. They were phenomenal. And it was really fun because it was something I'd wanted to do all my life, and it actually got done.
Yeah, sort of stepping back in time, the concerts in the park, and with the picnic spread out and sort of nostalgia.
And I actually played the Oakland Municipal Band in Oakland, California, had been in existence even back then for, I think, 150 years. It was one of the early bands, back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, even little tiny towns had the town band. And that band would do concerts all summer long, and so that this is a real American tradition, the concert band thing from back in the probably mid 1800s, and so the Oakland Municipal Band had been going a long time, and I played associate solo cornet with that band for quite a few years. So I was actually in that situation where, you know, you have a beautiful bandstand. It was at Lake Merritt. The lake was right behind the bandstand. It was a beautiful gazebo, you know, big enough for about an 80-piece band. And you're right, the people that'd be out there, there were no bleachers. I mean, the people would sit on the lawn with their lunches and everything, and there'd be a huge crowd. It was wonderful.
Tell me about Creeping with Clark.
Oh,
That came
well,
about.
the three biggest mentors in my life, said one was Don Jacoby and Stan Kenton and Clark Terry. And it was funny because we were playing Wichita Jazz Festival. I think this would have been 1970, maybe. And Clark's band opened for the Kenton band and his quintet. And so after the concert, Stan and Clark are talking, and Stan says, I want to meet your lead trumpet player. I mean, Clark says, I want to meet your lead trumpet player. So Stan introduced Clark and I, which became the friendship for the rest of the time until he passed away. And he was a true mentor to me in so many ways, especially since he knew that I liked, you know, was doing clinics and stuff. And then in 1978, I played lead trumpet on his big band for the European tour. And people say, what's it like playing lead trumpet on Clark Terry's band? And I'd say it's like getting a trumpet lesson every night of the week, because every night you're hearing him do stuff that you can't do on trumpet. I mean, just unbelievable. And of course, Clark was one of the nicest people ever put on the face of the earth. And he was one of the most important clinicians. He inspired so many young people. So I wrote this tune, Creeping with Clark, as sort of a joke. It's based on I got rhythm changes with just a few minor additions to the changes. But the joke was that you're supposed to play it as fast as you can, and I named it Creeping with Clark because no matter what the tempo was, it didn't matter to Clark. He was like nothing mattered to him. It didn't matter how fast you went. And so I wrote that tune in honor of him. And so we had talked for quite a few years about, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do an album together? And we got an angel that put up the money, and we recorded it at Sony Studios in New York City. And I flew in, and Reggie Thomas, the piano player, flew in. And it was Rufus Reed on bass who lived there, and Sylvia Cuenca, who's Clark's drummer for years, who lived there, and John Allred on trombone, who had just moved to New York, and Clark didn't know about John. Of course, John Allred's one of the great trombone players. And so we decided, okay, we got the money, we're going to do this. And we said, we got to record a lot of our own tunes. So we recorded some tunes that I wrote, we recorded some tunes that he wrote. And then he picked a couple of things, like he wanted to do Jive at Five in honor of, oh, come on, good, it just went out of my head, Sweet Edison. And so we picked all the tunes. I think we flew in on a Friday. We had a rehearsal Friday night, and then we recorded for 2 days. And of course, the word got out, so musicians are coming in the studio to see what's happening with the recording and stuff. And I have to say that one of the things that really gets to me, to his dying day, Clark said, Clark was on over 900 recordings. Believe it or not, it's documented. And to his dying day, he said that recording was one of the favorite recordings of anything he'd ever done. We just had such a great time doing it, and the music came out wonderfully, you know. And of course, I channel Clark because he's been my mentor and my idol for so long, especially on flugelhorn. So there are times on that recording. In fact, I'll tell you a great story. We were listening to the playback of Strutting with Some Barbecue, which we did as a samba, and Rufus Reed is saying something to Clark, and then we'll get back and we're listening, and it's when Clark and I are playing fours. And Clark looks at me and he says, is that me or is that you? And all I said was, thank you. But yeah, so
am I correct that you were at his bedside when he, near the end of his life?
Oh yeah, well, I was the party planner for his 90th and 94th birthday parties.
Mhm.
And the 94th was just a few months before he passed away. And a bunch of the guys that had been on his big band, all of us came together. And what's Stafford's last name? I'm going to forget, trombone player. Oh, darn. It played with Clark. Anyway, he sort of worked on getting the musicians there. So we actually had enough with adding some people to get out Clark's big band book. And we actually set up in his living room and played for him. And Clark, ever the educator, a couple of times he would say, he'd stop the band. No, that's the wrong tempo, or something like that. And do it this way. But yeah, so we were with him just a few months before he passed away.
Let me ask you about high notes. You have a way of talking about high notes are not necessarily higher, they're farther away.
Right. I learned that from Don Jacoby. It was interesting. Don Jacoby lived in Denton, Texas, the last part of his life. And for 20 years, every lead player in the 1 o'clock band at North Texas had studied with Jake, even though he wasn't on faculty. They would just go to his house for, separate lessons. And his philosophy was that up here, it was here and it was here. You can't see my hand, but the air, the diaphragm, and that was it. Your mental attitude and the air that you use. And that was his quote. High notes aren't higher, they're just farther away. And when you can, he showed me how to do this, and I've done it with young people, where you put 3 music stands, each one a little farther away, then you have the wall, and you get a young kid to say, okay, I'm going to tell you what notes to play, and give them a triad, like C, E, G, C, low register. And you say, now you're going to aim at each one of these, just like there was a laser beam that you can see leaving your horn. I added that part. And it's going to hit that music stand. And then you're going to hit the next one. And it's amazing. There are many times in clinics with young students where I've gotten them to play a 4th or a 5th higher than they ever played before within a few minutes. Because that the concentration and the thought that the air and the sound is moving away from you. And Doc Severinsen used to say, I think that way, I don't think this way. So the projection thing really helps. And I've been doing it for years and years, but I didn't invent that. It was from Don Jacoby.
You know Wayne Bergeron?
Oh, very well. What a great player. What a great guy. I mean, he's just amazing.
I want to read a brief quote from our interview, and there's not a question here, but I just wanted to share this with you. He said, when you're 12 years old and you can hit a double high C, your ego inflates pretty fast. I heard Maynard Ferguson playing high notes on the end of a tune, so I just played a high note on the end of everything. It didn't matter what the chord was. I just played a double high C because my friends were all going, all right, and they'd high five me.
No, that's so true, and it's an interesting phenomenon, I guess. There are some people, like Wayne was really a natural from the beginning. I was sort of a natural, but I wasn't one of those guys that just had it when I was young, and I had to work really hard to get where some other trumpet players already were, in high school and stuff, in junior high even. And so I had decided probably by the time I was 14 or 15, I want to be a trumpet player. I want to be a trumpet player. And so I had great teachers. Irving Corr, who was the solo cornetist in Oakland Municipal Band way before me, was my first teacher. Another teacher that was really important, who's still alive, Norm Tompak, who really got me into the jazz thing. He had written for Basie and Woody, and he was the leader of the Fort Ord Army Band at one point. And So he was important. And then in college, Gordon Finlay, who'd been the solo cornetist with the Navy Band in Washington for 20 years, I studied with him. And these people made me work. You know, I practiced a lot, and I practiced what they wanted me to. I didn't just sit and play tunes or whatever, although I did that afterwards. In fact, even when I was young, sometimes my mom would have to come in and stop me from practicing because they said, "You're not doing your homework." Do your homework and then you can play some more, you know. And so I think maybe that's one reason why I considered a good teacher, because it wasn't just natural to me. I had to go through a lot of work to get to where I ended up. And so I can sort of impart that to kids because of what I went through.
If you're playing two different charts, and on one chart you have to end on a G above the staff, a high G, and it happens to be the root of the chord. And then the next tune you have to end on that same high G, but in this case it's a very thick chord, a 13 chord or something, and your note is definitely not the root. Is the second G harder to play than the first one?
Harder isn't the right word. I hate the word hard in music because for kids, it makes it sound like, oh, I can't do it. It's impossible. I would say it's more of a challenge. Yeah, I would say that, and with the Kenton Band, a lot of that dissonance was close together was in the trumpet section way up high. And so if I'm on that high G and the second trumpet player is on an F and the third trumpet player is on a D and the fourth trumpet player is on a B flat or something, and it's you have to be sure. What the main thing is that playing a brass instrument's like being a singer. You have to hear the notes before you play them. A brass instrument isn't like a woodwind instrument. On a wood, they have their own challenges, but on a woodwind instrument, if you put a certain set of keys down, that note is coming out. On a brass instrument, there are no guarantees. It's here and it's the air and it's here and here. And so another thing about you were asking about lead trumpet, your ear has to be there. You have to hear the notes even before you play them. So if, and say that, you've finished this big chart and there's an 8-bar drum solo and bam, the last chord, you better know what that note is before you're going to hit it. And I think that it also has to do with feeling. I feel notes in my body. I can feel what things, not just here, but in your whole body, because you're using your diaphragmatic area, you're using your brain, you're using your ears. And so it's a matter of hearing and feeling the notes probably before you play them.
Is that teachable?
Yes. But it takes a student who wants to work hard enough. And what I tell students in the clinics is if you've got a hard lead trumpet part, and like a shout chorus, and you want to really practice it and be able to play those notes and hit each one 3 times down an octave, 1 time where it's written, the intervals sound exactly the same. So what you're hearing in different octaves is the same notes. So why kill your chops? 3 times down an octave, 1 time where it's written. And you use that as a way to practice. If you want to do it, quite a few times, then you're not killing yourself. But this is hearing the intervals, and it's hearing the placement of the notes.
Sometimes I get the feeling that the surrounding sonority helps that note come out. I don't know if it's my imagination or it's like if I try to play a high note above the range on the saxophone, I tried it in the practice room, I'm not going to get it. But tonight, when the band is playing around you, I have a better chance that it might come out.
I think that that helps. Yeah, I think, and part of the challenge of getting to where you can play that, like especially for a trumpet player, is to be able to do it by yourself with no help. And then when you get with the band, I agree with you. All that sonority and everything actually helps. But one of the things that, like on the Kenton band, you know, the what they used to call the that huge cymbal, the eliminator. You know, that huge cymbal that was on that Stan had for the band. You know why it was called the eliminator? It eliminated a first trumpet player's high G. There was something about the overtones in that. It could eliminate, and there were like at the end of Malaga, when he'd hold that high G forever, and Von Olen's, boy, you got to get that note out because that cymbal is going to try to just eliminate you.
That reminds me of a Joe Wilder story when I think it was on the Hampton band or something. They had this mythical thing called the Barracuda that would get rid of things that they didn't want. I can just see someone losing that cymbal.
Oh, no. The band loved that cymbal.
Oh, no kidding.
It was part of the sound of the band. One of the things that they did do one time, because back with the mellophone band, and with the Kenton band, those mellophones were out of tune. They were not great instruments. And there had been a mellophonium before with Kahn, but Johnny Richards and Stan went to Kahn, and I think the mellophoniums were in E flat, but Johnny Richards wanted them in F, and they fiddled with them. And so the sound was amazing, but they were not really very well in tune. And boy, those guys had to work. And of course, they were so loud. I mean, whoa, they were louder than trumpets or the trombones. So people were always trying to get rid of the mellophones. And at one point, I guess some of them ended up in a swimming pool at a motel. But that's not, Stan, the reason Stan stopped the mellophone band, I think only went about 3.5 years. And it was basically the same as people ask me, well, with the Kent Legacy Orchestra, how come you don't have mellophones? The same reason Stan had to get rid of them. I got to pay 4 more guys. Where am I going to get the money?
Yeah. What did you guys do on the bus trips? This is, pre cell phones, pre Walkmans. How did you pass your time?
Some guys read books. A lot of guys had some kind of a boom box, but on the bus it was like you used earphones. You did not bug everybody else with what you wanted to, unless it was something that everybody wanted to listen to, But yeah, people read books, people read newspapers, people listened to music a lot, and there were numerous discussions about Stan. This was really sort of a funny thing. Stan was a very conservative guy, and of course a lot of musicians are very liberal, and he would go in the back of the bus and he'd start some kind of political thing, and then these guys in the back would all be arguing. He'd come up to the front laughing and say, "Look what I started." But yeah, there were, we discussed, and there was a lot of discussion of music, not just the music we were playing, but music history, other bands, people that we liked listening to. So it was, you found ways to pass the time. But you're right, kids ask, well, what was it like being on a road band on the bus? Say, well, if there was an emergency, you had to hope that there was going to be a small town coming up pretty soon on the highway, and you had to hope that there was a gas station with a payphone, and you had to hope you had change.
Wow. How primitive.
About it. There was no way to communicate. You're right. There was no way to communicate with the outside world. Being on a band bus was like living in a cocoon. And each person had their area, which was usually, 2 seats, and everything they owned for the road was in that area and above. And it's like, being on a road band is like being in a family. And the family gets along, but sometimes the family doesn't always get along, and a cocoon. That's all I can say. You're stuck on this moving sphere, you know, for 6, 7, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. You know, I mean, if we had other than the summer camps, which of course we loved because everybody enjoyed teaching, but also we were in one place for 6 nights. But other than that, if you had a gig where you were 2 nights in the same hotel, ooh, I was like, wow, look at this. This is great, you know. I think it was a great story. One time we had not had a day off in 6 or 7 weeks, 7 nights a week on the road, all one-nighters. We played some resort for 2 nights. And so the second day, unbeknownst to each other, all the trumpet players washed their horns out, which you don't do as much as you should on the road. Well, that night, we're fracking and we're cracking and Stan comes back, what the hell is wrong with a trumpet section? I said, I don't know. And I found out we had all washed our horns out that day. So you got a different bore trumpet.
You didn't have all that juice in there to play through. Wow. There's a quote here. Someone's saying, I think they're saying that you said this. It was in amongst the things you sent me. Mike Vax reminded us all that being a great musician is far more important than being a great trumpeter. He exemplifies this concept with every fiber of his being.
Oh, that was from, I did this is quite a while now, the first Westchester Trumpet Festival, which was a big one. And I was a feature artist. It was an interesting thing because I had throat surgery, I think 3 weeks before, and they didn't cut me, they went through, but I had nodes on my vocal cords. I was starting to sound like Miles, man. It was, you know, and I couldn't talk very loud. And so for 2 weeks, I couldn't talk and I couldn't play. So I had a week and I got myself back together as much as I could. And I told the promoter of the festival, I said, I'm probably not going to play too many high notes while I'm there. And he said, you mean you can actually come? And I said, yeah, the doctor doesn't like it, but he said, you can come. So I get there and I did the last clinic. We'd done a couple of concerts with some really good trumpet players and stuff. And then I did the last clinic of the festival. And I've always professed that for somebody who really wants to play, the instrument is not what's important. The music is what is important. And I don't care whether you're a violin player or a piano player or a trumpet player or you play kazoo. You've got to get past the instrument. Too many players, especially trumpet players, let's face it, our egos are terrible. So too many trumpet players, it's the high notes, man, and it's loud, and how fast can I play on this solo, you know? And there's got to be a reason why Chet Baker was so famous. It had to do with music, you know? And you take you take the complete opposite end, say Chet Baker and Maynard Ferguson. But if you heard Maynard play a ballad, or you heard Maynard play a jazz solo that was just amazing, you know, that recording of Maynard and Clifford Brown and Clark Terry with Dinah Washington. I don't know if you've heard that, but she actually got them to play on a recording session. They were all around the recording studio. And Maynard is right there with Clark and Clifford, I gotta say, you know. And so, and Maynard, I remember an interview with Maynard where, you know, somebody asked him about screech trumpet playing, because that was the title back then.
Screech.
And he hated that word. He said, I'm not a screech trumpet player, I'm a musician. He said, I don't care how high I'm playing, I'm trying to play music. You know, and that stuck with me. I think that, and again, for classical players, you know, you hear some classical players who are just phenomenal technically, and it doesn't move you at all. All the notes are right, but there's nothing else. And so to put your personality, and in classical music, you can't change it around like you can with jazz, but there has to be some of you in what you play, and there has to be more than just the notes on your instrument. So I've always professed that what you strive for is to be a great musician, not a great player.
Do you know Joe Wilder? Did you know him?
I know of him. I didn't know him.
Yes. Okay. When you said that about putting personal expression into classical music, it made me think of him because he did that. He could do that. Well, this has just been a fascinating conversation, and I wonder, to wrap up, if you think back to when Stan and a few of the others sort of launched jazz education, could you envision what now in 2022, what the business of jazz education has arrived at, the state of it now?
It's interesting. The original National Association of Jazz Educators, the original one, was basically Stan's idea. And they were at, I forget if it was Midwest or they were at one of the big conventions, and the Kenton Band had played. And I can tell you some of the guys that were there: Leon Breeden, Gene Hall, Jack Wheaton, Herb Wong, Matt Benton. They were in Stan's suite, and they were bemoaning about, there's no jazz at these conventions. There's nothing going on. What do we do? Basically, get off your butts and start something and get it going. And what a lot of people don't know is Stan put up the original money. He said, we have to get this. And Stan was that one of the things that, with the Kenton Legacy Orchestra that we say is we are not trying to be the Stan Kenton Orchestra. We are carrying on his tradition of jazz education and creative music. He believed that if jazz was going to survive, you had to get to the young people. Because how else are you going to forget more musicians? How are you going to have an audience? If young people aren't being exposed to it, how is there going to be an audience in another 10, 15, 20 years? And so he really believed, and he was the first band leader to bring his band into schools on a regular basis. And from that, Maynard did it, and Woody did it, and even Basie a little bit. But he was really the first one to get that going. And of course, with the National Stage Band Camps, which became the Kenton Summer Camps, Ken Morris was the administrator of those, and had come to Stan and said, I want to start summer jazz camps, and I want you, to be the resident band. And Stan jumped at it immediately. And so they formed, the first one was 1959. And then I went to the one in 1960, and it was at Indiana University. And of course, it blossomed out into where they were doing 5 or 6 every summer, and so I think that what has happened in schools, and it's sort of gone backwards a little bit. I'm sad to say, but during the 60s and 70s and 60s, it was getting started. 70s, it got strong. And 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, it was really strong. And even before COVID, to say it, but as you said, I'm outspoken. Too many young band directors have gotten to the point where the trophy is the most important thing, not teaching the history of the music or teaching a love of the music. It's how many trophies do we have in the band room? And so, let me get that. So they'll rehearse 3, 4, or 5 tunes over and over and over all semester, so they can go win trophies. And that's not education. That's not what Stan envisioned. That's not what most of us in jazz education envision. And one of the things that when I do, sometimes I'll do a clinic at a state convention for the educators. And I'll say, how many of you actually delve into the history of jazz music with your students? How many of you play old recordings for your students? Rehearsals aren't just about learning the tunes to go to contest. Rehearsals have to be part of making these students love the music. If you don't know the history of the music, how are you going to have a love for it? You know, and so many young people, I mean, it's gone even farther now, but, you know, a few years ago when we were doing it, young people would think that like Coltrane and Charlie Parker were like traditional jazz. They had no idea about what went on in the early part of the 20th century in New Orleans and Chicago and San Francisco and New York and Kansas City. No idea. They barely know the name Louis Armstrong, you know? And so what I tell the band directors is, you know, you got the greatest thing to use right now, and that's the internet. You know, you can go on YouTube. You can see people who died 50 years ago playing a concert. So on your, I can't say blackboard anymore because the boards are all white now, you know. Say on your whiteboard, every week, put a name. And your students have to Google that name, and they have to listen on YouTube, and they have to go to Wikipedia and have them write a one paragraph thing about that person. And, you know, the band directors that have done it have said to me, you know, the students get a new, I don't know, maybe love of the music is wrong, but a new interest in the music, because now they're finding out where they came from. You know, I mean, Gordon Goodwin writes wonderful charts, but that's not where big band music came from. You know, and if all the band director does is play mainly Gordon Goodwin charts, and then nothing against Gordon at all, but why don't they play some Basie charts? Why don't they, you know, why don't they play some Kenton charts? Why don't they play some Woody Herman charts? And if they were doing that at their concerts, you'd be surprised how many of the parents and grandparents would say, "Oh, wait a minute, I remember that tune." You know, but I think that the education and the history has to be taught, and it isn't just about winning trophies.
That's well said, and I can't think of a better way to wrap up here. Congratulations on your career.
Well, thank you. I've been very lucky. You know, I'm now 80 and still playing, and we're planning a tour for the Stan Kenton Legacy Orchestra next April in the Midwest, and I'm crazy enough to try to keep it going.
Yeah, I think a little crazy helps.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Mike, and you look forward to seeing yourself on YouTube eventually with this interview, and it's just been a real thrill for me.
Oh, listen, I'm happy to do it, and you know, it's interesting because when Nick Mandello and I were talking about you, he said he's going to have interesting questions, much more interesting than a lot of people who interview, and he was exactly right. Now, this has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot. I'll see you on the flip side somewhere.
Great.
All right.